Fishermen hauled an old space capsule from the ocean floor, and what they found inside shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. Captain Leon Hale had weathered many dawns at sea, yet each one still found a way to feel new. The ocean never rose twice with the same shape. Every sunrise dressed itself in a different color, painted over a different horizon, breathed a different breath from its rolling depths. Still, this morning carried a deceptive sense of routine. The sky was an overcast sheet of pale gray, and a thin mist clung to the harbor waters like a veil reluctant to lift. As the trawler, Mary Ann, rumbled out from the docks, Leon stood at the helm with his familiar, stoic posture, one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting loosely at his side. His eyes, aged by salt and sun, scanned forward into the early haze with a calm that came from decades of obeying the sea's rules. The crew bustled around him, stamping boots across the deck slick with condensation, coiling ropes, checking the nets, warming cold hands with cheap coffee poured from dented thermoses. These men were his second family, though he rarely admitted it out loud. People came and went throughout his career, but the essence of the crew never changed. Practical, tired, superstitious, stubborn, seamen were cut from the same cloth the world over. Each one carried burdens the ocean couldn't wash away, no matter how deep it pulled them from shore. Leon had come from nothing. Born in a small coastal town where opportunity evaporated as fast as it appeared, he had clawed his way to captaincy through grit alone. There were no shortcuts for a poor black kid with a dead father and a mother juggling multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. The sea was both the villain and the savior of his youth. It swallowed fishermen whole without remorse, but also offered the only real chance he had to escape a life of dead ends. The first time he smelled diesel on seawater and felt the deck pulse under his feet as a boat cut through the waves, he knew there was no going back. The ocean had chosen him. His years in the U.S. Navy had carved discipline into his veins. The people who trained him, the storms he survived, the losses he witnessed, everything hardened him into precisely the man the Mary Ann now depended on. And though he had left military service behind long ago, the code he lived by had never loosened its grip. You didn't turn your back on your crew. You didn't abandon what you pulled from the deep. The sea tested your character, but it also demanded loyalty in return. On this particular morning, there was no reason to expect the day would be anything other than another long haul of work. They had set off for a routine fishing run about 100 miles from shore. The radar showed stable weather. The season had been middling, neither abundant nor disastrous, but Leon hoped they'd come back with enough catch to keep the spirits and paychecks steady. The men were anxious for a good week. Nobody liked scraping by, and Leon, though a captain, was no stranger to the same quiet worry that haunted every man aboard. When the fish were scarce, so was life's breathing room. He eyed the crew as they finished preparations. Marcus, his sturdy first mate, moved with precise efficiency, barking quiet corrections when a knot was tied wrong or a cable not properly latched. Marcus never smiled much, but Leon trusted the man like a brother. Young Eddie, the greenhorn of the bunch, still had that wide-eyed fascination with everything around him. Today would likely be his 20th time asking if dolphins would appear. The mechanic, Joe, slunk out from below deck, wiping grease from his hands, already annoyed at the engine for reasons he hadn't yet explained. Each man had his place, and Leon knew exactly how to keep them working like parts of a well-worn machine. The ocean welcomed them with only a minor chop. Seagulls trailed overhead, squawking impatiently for scraps. Eddie pretended not to flinch when a wing brushed a little too close to his hair. Someone chuckled. The air tasted like brine and steel, familiar as breath itself. Hours passed with quiet conversation and the rhythmic whining of winches. The nets went out, the nets came back in, sometimes heavy, often disappointingly light. Nothing unusual. Around midday, Marcus stepped into the wheelhouse, bringing the smell of salt and damp rope with him. "We should shift west," he suggested. Leon studied the sonar's blurry scroll of ocean topography. There was a cluster of signals there, possibly a school of fish, possibly not. The sea rarely revealed its hand so easily. "Let's try it," Leon answered after a moment, nudging the helm. The Mary Ann adjusted course, engines groaning as though complaining about the extra work. Clouds pressed lower now, tinting the seascape a darker shade of pewter. Leon glanced at the barometer. The weather remained steady for now. The next drop of nets went smoothly. Leon stepped out onto the deck, checking lashings as the men prepared to hoist them back up. He didn't expect anything different from the last dozen times they'd worked these waters. Certainly nothing worth remembering. But then the first warning sign appeared, subtle yet unmistakable. The winch shuddered. At first, Leon thought it was just a jam. Sometimes seaweed twisted around the line and forced the mechanism to strain, but the shudder didn't fade. Instead, the tension in the wire spiked rapidly, sending a harsh metallic shriek knifing through the air. The men froze mid-motion, heads snapping toward the machinery as if the sound were a threat in itself. Marcus reacted first, rushing to the controls. "Something heavy," he muttered, voice low but tight. Eddie stepped backward, eyes growing large at the trembling steel cable stretching like a drawn bowstring. Joe climbed over equipment to inspect the winch drum, jaw clenched. The boat listed slightly starboard under the sudden weight tugging from below. Leon's instinct sharpened. You learned to read danger at sea not through explanation, but through a shift in the air, a collective gut feeling. He raised his voice, steady and authoritative, enough to cut through the rising murmur of apprehension. "Slow the winch. Don't force it. Ease it up." Marcus complied, adjusting the controls. The agonizing screech eased to a strained groan, though the water beneath their feet still pulled at the line with stubborn force. Something deep below was snagged in the nets, anchored in darkness long enough to grow heavy with time. The tension crept upward. Inch by inch, whatever they'd latched onto began to ascend. The crew exchanged glances, a silent conversation of possibilities. A sunken log, a piece of wreckage from a forgotten boat. The ocean floor was littered with relics of tragedy and failure. Fishermen found strange objects more often than outsiders might imagine, but Leon sensed this was different. There was a density to the weight, a type of resistance that didn't match driftwood or machinery. The starboard side dipped further, making boots slide toward the rail before the hull adjusted and steadied again. The sea beneath them sloshed angrily at the disturbance, as if protesting. Joe muttered curses under his breath. "If that thing snaps, we lose the whole damn net." It was a valid concern. A torn net meant a major financial blow, and those costs rippled down to every paycheck. The weight on the line wasn't just physical. It was an economic gamble, a risk every man understood with a prickling in his chest. Leon stepped toward the rails, gaze locked on the sea where bubbles churned up from the depths. A faint, dark outline began to materialize under the surface, moving upward too slowly for comfort. The mist thickened around them, making the world feel suddenly small, as though they had entered a different realm entirely, one in which the ocean held its breath. Someone whispered a nervous prayer. Someone else spat superstition over the side. Sailors had a ritual for every fear. The object finally broke the surface with a heaving pull from the winch. Water cascaded off a smooth yet battered metallic shape, spilling onto the deck like freed ghosts. What they had dredged up was no ship debris, no rusted engine block. It was too symmetrical, too deliberate in its construction. A truncated cone of steel, scarred by time yet unmistakably engineered for a purpose beyond laying on the sea floor. Leon's breath stilled in his chest for a heartbeat. It looked like a capsule. Not marine, not modern, something older, something that did not belong to fishermen. The crew gaped as the team wrestled it fully aboard, guiding the dripping hulk onto the deck with groaning machinery and hands cautious with confusion. Seaweed clung to its pitted flanks like long dead hair. Sections of the exterior had blistered as though once exposed to unbearable heat, and partially hidden beneath grime and barnacles, Leon spotted what might once have been paint. A faded mark, a symbol, a star beside a striped pattern. His pulse quickened. A stirring of memory flickered to life, grainy footage of space race triumphs, class lessons about humanity pushing beyond Earth. Capsules that fell back into oceans, recovered by proud ships and welcomed with celebration. The American dream launched skyward and reeled home. But this one, no cheers had welcomed it, no headlines. It had never reached the hands of those waiting for it. The deck fell silent, broken only by the slow dripping of seawater from the object's seams. Leon stepped closer, his boots leaving wet prints on the steel. Mist curled around him as he traced his eyes along the mysterious relic. The realization settled onto him with the weight of a cresting wave. They had not caught just any piece of scrap. The Mary Ann had hauled up a forgotten piece of history from the ocean's dark memory, something that was never meant to return to light, and in the hollow of Leon's chest an unspoken recognition formed. Whatever lay inside this capsule could change far more than the unfinished ledger of a fishing trip. The sea was giving them something back, something it had held too long. Behind him, the crew waited for their captain to decide what came next, and the ocean watched, silent and unknowable. The deck of the Mary Ann no longer felt like a place for fishermen. It felt like a stage where something historic had just surfaced, something that had no business being hauled up by nets meant for tuna and cod. The mysterious capsule rested there like a slumbering monster, its dull metal gleaming through patches of slime and barnacles. Each passing minute seemed to squeeze the air tighter around the men. They watched it as though waiting for it to move on its own, to breathe, or perhaps to reveal an eye behind the thick window set into its side. Leon stared at the object, each breath slow and measured. He could feel the shiver crawling beneath the skin of the crew. In 30 years at sea, he had dragged up old anchors, parts of wrecks, engines tangled in nets, even a lost shipping container full of plastic toys once. But nothing like this. Nothing that hummed with the weight of forgotten intentions, nothing with a symbol that had once been a nation's pride. The ocean had kept this secret swallowed for decades, and now the Mary Ann had wrestled it from its grave. The crew lingered a few paces back, unwilling to approach without an order. Leon moved closer to the corroded metal and brushed aside the rough layer of dried algae with his gloved hand. Beneath the muck, hints of paint appeared, white, red, blue, though nearly erased by salt and time. The faint shadow of a star, the outline of a faded flag. The capsule bore scars of fire as well, long streaks of char across one side, as if it had once burned fiercely while plummeting back toward Earth. It had survived a hellish return, only to drown in a silent, lonely tomb far below. Joe, the mechanic, finally dared to crouch beside it. He ran his fingers along the ridged seams. "Spacecraft," he said, his voice rough, barely more than a breath. "Old one. Real old." His disbelief wavered between awe and dread. Eddie hovered behind him, too curious to stay away but too terrified to speak. Leon's eyes traveled along every curve of the capsule. He knew he had to make choices now. His crew depended on him to think clearly, even when everything felt unreal. The ocean did this sometimes, returned lost stories without explanation, but a captain had to respond with reason. He motioned Marcus over. "We need to secure it properly," he said. Marcus nodded immediately. Even fear could not shake his discipline. They set to work with chains and braces, making sure the capsule could not roll or shift as the boat swayed. Every clang of metal on metal sent a pulse of unease through the men. The object was too human in design, too silent in its long captivity. Something about it felt like a coffin. Once it was stable, Leon stepped back, narrowing his eyes at the small glass porthole set into the side. It was dark beyond the scratched lens, the interior concealed by grime and shadows. Joe took a rag from a toolbox and wiped at the thick residue, revealing nothing but a deeper darkness inside. They saw no movement, no flicker of light, but the possibility of what might lie within pressed against their imaginations like an invisible hand on the chest. "We need to know what's inside," one of the crew murmured behind them. It wasn't a suggestion. It was the voice of animal terror wrapped in logic. Humans feared what they didn't understand. A closed container from another era, raised from the depths, screamed mystery and danger. Leon's mind raced with scenarios. It could be hazardous: corroded fuel tanks, compressed gas, toxic chemicals from an era when safety protocols were not what they were today. It could be radioactive, or it could contain nothing but shattered remnants long decayed by time. Yet, it could also contain a story, one that deserved not to rot unseen in darkness again. He crouched and examined the hatch. The circular door was sealed tight, bolted in place by thick rusted latches. The hinges had likely fused together after years underwater. But someone at NASA had built this door to be opened once, and Leon intended to honor that design. Marcus broke the silence. "Should call someone," he said. "We find something like this, government will want to handle it." Leon turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You think they'll let us keep it long enough to learn anything?" he asked. "They'd fly in here with gloves and guns and take the whole thing before we knew what it was." There was a bitter familiarity to his tone, born of a lifetime encountering institutions that took control without asking. Marcus didn't argue, but his jaw tightened. They were in waters governed by rules, not curiosity. Eddie finally spoke. Maybe there's a body inside." His voice cracked at the thought. Everyone went silent again. The possibility wasn't absurd. Early space missions included live beings strapped into lonely machines. If one of those capsules never returned, what became of its passenger? Leon stood. "We open it," he declared after a long, heavy pause. The decision felt like stepping across a line drawn by fate. None of them objected. They wanted answers as much as he did. Fear was something they could swallow. Uncertainty was harder to digest. Joe fetched his strongest pry bar and a crow's foot wrench, tools meant for thick bolts and stubborn engines. Marcus held a flashlight angled at the hatch. Leon and Joe worked together, struggling against corrosion that clung like the ocean itself didn't want to let go. Every bolt that cracked loose echoed like gunfire across the deck. The air was colder here, or maybe the men just felt it more sharply with every turn of the wrench. When all the bolts were loosened enough, Joe wedged the pry bar into a seam. He heaved. Nothing moved. He tried again. Metal moaned under the force. Leon added his weight. The hatch gave the faintest lurch. Another grunt. A tearing shriek of rusted hinges. Then, with one final push, a hiss of air escaped like a long-held breath released. The seal broke. The hatch creaked open a few inches. The smell hit them first. A stale confinement of old steel, rubber, and something harsher lingering beneath. A scent difficult to place. A life that ended where it should have been rescued. Leon's heart began to pound. They widened the opening slowly, the old door groaning like a voice disturbed from eternal sleep. The interior remained shrouded in thick gloom. Marcus raised the flashlight and cast its beam inside. The crew leaned closer, breath held as if the smallest sound might wake something. The flash of light pierced the darkness, revealing a cramped cockpit lined with tangled wires and brittle padding. At its center, strapped rigidly into a molded flight couch, was a figure. Small, humanoid in outline. Bones held together by remnants of a suit that once fit snug around a living body. A skull rested against a padded headrest, its hollow sockets pointed toward nothing, its jaw slightly open as though frozen mid-breath many decades ago. The figure was unmistakably that of a chimpanzee. For a moment, none of the crew could move. Time seemed to collapse inward, shrinking the world to the narrow confines of that single beam of light. Eddie stumbled backward, a hand flying to his mouth. Joe's grip on the pry bar loosened. Marcus swore under his breath, though the word sounded like a prayer. Leon stared, stunned, throat tightening as he saw the straps, still fastened. Sensors, once clipped to its body, now dangled loosely, their wires frayed by corrosion. The suet bore faded patches, data labels in peeling print. The chimp's bones had not scattered. They had not disintegrated. They were preserved by restraint, by design, by abandonment. Its mission had included a return. Its mission had not included a rescue. Leon looked away for a moment, his jaw clenched hard enough to ache. A wave of anger, sorrow, and disbelief surged together in a knotted mass inside him. All at once, that capsule was no longer just a piece of machinery. It was a tomb. A holding cell where a living being had waited and waited until waiting was the only thing left it could do. Behind him, a gull cried in the mist. The sound felt painfully alive compared to the silence trapped in the capsule. Marcus lowered the flashlight slightly and spoke quietly, though his words quivered at the edges. We shouldn't have opened it." Leon shook his head once, steadying himself. "No," he said, "we needed to. Someone should have, long ago." The capsule had carried a brave passenger into the unknown. It had returned victorious from its flight, survived the fires of re-entry, and reached the ocean's surface alive. Yet no hand had ever reached out to pull its occupant from the dark. No announcement had been made to celebrate the mission. No name had been engraved on plaques or spoken in classrooms. Someone had erased it. Leon gazed again at the lifeless figure, trying to imagine what it had felt in those final hours. The slow dimming of hope, the thickening air, the fear no creature deserved. He noticed a rusted metal box tucked near the seat. A container, sealed tight. Documents, perhaps. Evidence. Proof of a mission that just disappeared. But that could wait another moment. Leon stepped back from the open hatch and pulled a tarp over the opening, just enough to shield the remains from sea spray. His movements grew gentle, as if handling a fallen comrade. Respect came naturally. Honor was his instinct. The men looked to him again, searching his face for guidance, for certainty in a moment where nothing felt real. Leon knew they needed words, but his voice lagged behind his thoughts. At last, he spoke. "We take it home," he said. "It deserves that much." The ocean rolled beneath the hull, a deep and ancient breath. The wind shifted as though listening. The Mary Ann, once just a fishing trawler among many, now carried a forgotten astronaut, one who'd been lost to history but found by fate. The crew stood around the capsule with a strange, reverent stillness. The discovery had changed something irreversibly. The water that had always felt familiar now seemed heavy with secrets. Leon looked out into the endless gray sea, realizing they were no longer just fishermen harvesting their living. They had become messengers of truth stolen by silence, and the journey ahead would not be as simple as returning with a good catch. The ocean had delivered them a burden, one they could not put back. They just didn't yet know how heavy it really was. The ocean breeze had turned sharper as the afternoon dragged into a bleak, diluted sort of daylight, the kind where the sky offered little comfort and even less warmth. The Mary Ann drifted with a strange solemnity, engines idling at low power while the crew stood around the now opened capsule, no longer treating it as salvage or mere cargo. The sight inside had altered everything, every thought, every breath. Even the youngest crewman, usually quick to recover from shock with jokes or nervous laughter, kept silent. Leon stood closest to the open hatch, one hand resting on the edge of the corroded metal door. He stared at the figure still strapped into the narrow couch, a skeleton encased in a suit that had once been tailored for a living being with research attached to its veins. The straps, the final and only embrace this creature had known for decades, still held its bones in place as though fearing the collapse of dignity if they let go. He felt something heavy inside his chest. The chimp had been a passenger in humanity's bold stride toward the stars. And yet, that same humanity, so desperate for progress, had forgotten to look down when one of its stepping stones fell and sank. Behind him, footsteps shifted on the deck. Eddie approached cautiously, his face pale and eyes fixed on the remains. His voice came out thin, the words barely forming. It was waiting, wasn't it?" The boy swallowed hard. "Someone was supposed to open that door." Leon didn't answer right away. There was nothing to say that didn't feel too small. "Yes," he replied finally. "Someone was." He reached over and steadied the tarp that now covered the top portion of the hatch, shielding the remains from the elements. It felt like the least he could do. The smell that had escaped from the capsule still clung faintly to the air, a smell of old steel, decayed rubber, and something deeper, something that spoke of the final, lonely breaths taken in a space never intended for dying. Marcus cleared his throat from a few steps away. "We should see what else is inside." His tone was subdued, lacking his usual firm assurance. The discovery had stripped bravado from everyone. Leon nodded. The container he'd spotted earlier sat wedged near the pilot couch, corroded but mostly intact. He reached for it with careful fingers, trying not to disturb the fragile bones. The lid resisted at first, but then clicked open with a reluctant stiffness. Inside lay documents, protected beneath transparent sleeves that time had yellowed but not destroyed. The papers bore stamps and designations, cryptic codes and technical descriptions typed in neat lines. He scanned a page where clipped words leapt into clarity. Biomedical telemetry. Orbit achieved. Landing coordinates confirmed. This wasn't a failed experiment. It was a triumph. The chimp had come home. No one had bothered to welcome him. Carefully, Leon pulled out a more personal item, a worn name tag, edges curled, the ink faded but still legible. Ajax. Not a number, not an object, a name, a simple word that transformed the skeleton from an unidentifiable being into a hero with an identity. Ajax. A creature sent beyond the clouds, beyond the reach of any natural life expectancy for his kind. He had trusted the instincts embedded in him, endured the crushing weight of departure and the silence of space, only to meet an end so brutally mundane. Joe joined Leon at the open hatch, wiping sweat and seawater from his forehead. His voice was gruffer than usual, but there was a softness beneath the surface. "They left him to die," he said, pretended none of this ever happened. Leon didn't respond, but the words echoed through him. The plans made by people in bright offices far away from the risks had decided this being's fate. Progress had mattered. The individual had not. As Leon glanced deeper into the capsule, he noticed something else. Scratches on the interior near the armrests, faint grooves arching where fingers might have clawed during a desperate moment. The idea that Ajax might have fought against the straps, realizing too late that no one was coming, tightened the knot of sorrow in Leon's chest until it hurt to breathe. His mind drifted unwillingly to his own past. He had lost crew members before. Storms, mechanical failures, bad luck that took good men in an instant. But even when the sea claimed lives, he honored the bodies, whispered their names, ensured they were carried home or committed to the deep with a sailor's dignity. To imagine being left in silence, trapped and forgotten, he shivered involuntarily. The documents revealed only fragments. The mission had been classified. That spoke loudest of all. There were orders stamped in bold ink, for internal review only. And another line, grim in its brevity, all remaining materials to be destroyed upon recovery. Recovery that had never come. Marcus leaned over Leon's shoulder and exhaled through his teeth. They buried this so deep nobody even remembered to come look. His eyes scanned the digits denoting the date of launch, early 1960s, the height of the space race. America and the Soviet Union had been locked in a feverish battle to be first in everything. Some victories were worth parading to the world. Others were worth hiding under the weight of shame or political inconvenience. Leon shut the metal container gently and set it on the deck. The crew watched, unsure of what to do with their hands, their thoughts, their emerging guilt. In this moment, Ajax was no longer a distant product of a bygone era. He was here, among them, and his story demanded justice. Eddie stood closest, his trembling fingers hovering near the edge of the capsule without touching it. What do we do with him?" he finally asked. Leon thought of the simplest truth he knew, that every life brave enough to face death deserved remembrance. That the dead hung weightlessly over the living until someone anchored their story. "We take him home," he repeated more firmly now. "We make sure the world knows he existed." Joe nodded slowly, like a man reaching a difficult conclusion. The others looked away, perhaps because their eyes were suspiciously bright, with more emotion than they wished to admit. Even hardened men could feel the gravity of a soul given purpose and denied honor. Leon rose and walked toward the bow, needing a moment to steady his thoughts. The ship rocked gently beneath him, indifferent to the revelation taking place on her deck. He could hear the metallic creak of the capsule settling into its restraints. He pictured Ajax alive, penetrating the black vacuum above, staring out through a small window at the curve of Earth, ignorant of politics or secrecy. He imagined the heartbeat sensors registering panic, confusion, maybe wonder. He imagined the weightless drift, the jarring return through a fiery sky. He imagined the wait, the long wait, a life suspended in a steel coffin where silence was the only companion. Back near the capsule, Eddie whispered, "Do you think he was scared?" Leon closed his eyes, letting the wind carry the sting from his face. "Everyone is scared when they're alone," he replied quietly. Marcus cleared his throat again, shifting the conversation toward the future. "We should secure the hatch," he said. "Keep everything intact until we get word from someone who knows how to handle this properly." His voice wavered between responsibility and fear, as though worried that touching the capsule any longer might awaken the past in ways none of them could control. "No," Leon answered softly but firmly. "We already know how to handle him, with respect." He closed the hatch slowly, sealing away the darkness once more, though that darkness had already spilled into their hearts. The men began clearing equipment from around the capsule, treating the area like sacred ground. They worked quietly, as though noise might disturb the dead astronaut's rest. A solemn air settled over the deck, dampening the usual banter and replacing it with careful motions and thoughtful silence. In the wheelhouse, Leon examined charts and coordinates. The recovery position, handwritten in the documents, aligned eerily close to where they had trawled their nets. It was as if the capsule had waited for them specifically, or maybe fate had decided that enough time had passed, that Ajax had been anonymous long enough. Night would come soon, and the ocean seldom allowed a crew to dwell too long on their trauma. Work remained, even when hearts strained under new burdens. Leon checked the horizon but saw only a thickening veil of gray. Weather was shifting, though gently for now. When he returned to the deck, some of the men were gathered near the rail, smoking in silence, staring at the place where sea met sky. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Their thoughts were turned inward, each man questioning what else the water might hide beneath its eternal murk. They were small against the world's enormity, sailors drifting not just on waves, but on the fragile thread of fate. Leon approached Joe, who stood alone inspecting the winch. "You're thinking," Leon said. Joe didn't bother denying it. "We found a piece of history," he said, eyes on the machinery but mind somewhere else entirely, "but history finds ways of not wanting to be disturbed." Leon met his gaze. "Maybe history should have thought twice about abandoning its own." Joe grunted. "Maybe." The engine hummed below deck, a reminder of the living world continuing. Leon took one last look at the capsule before heading inside to review the documents again. Names, serial numbers, mission notes, everything painted a picture of ambition and sacrifice, success and betrayal. Ajax was a hero whose victory had suspiciously looked like an embarrassment in someone's cold calculation. A symbol erased, yet still breathing truth into the present moment through the bones he left behind. Leon's fingers brushed over a line of text. Landing date confirmed. The ink, though faded, carried an accusation. He stared out at the rolling gray sea and understood there was no turning back. They could not pretend they had found nothing. The story now belonged to the living to tell. As twilight crept across the horizon and the last light dissolved into a soft violet bruise of sky, the crew of the Mary Ann found a new purpose. They would do what government and history had failed to do. They would bring Ajax home, and the world would have to hear him roar after death. The sea had a way of flattening the world into silence after a revelation, as though the waves themselves were processing what had been disturbed from their depths. On the Mary Ann, that silence lingered far beyond the quiet of ordinary nights at sea. It clung to every surface, the metal railings, the chilled air, the salt-stained decks, as if the ocean was still deciding whether it had made a mistake in surrendering its secret. Crew members moved with subdued motions, heads lowered, their voices trapped in throats unwilling to speak too loud in the presence of the capsule that held more than bones. It held the proof of a forgotten story. Leon had not slept. He sat in the wheelhouse under the dim glow of a single instrument light, the documents salvaged from the capsule spread across the console before him. The paper edges were stiff, some flaking with age, yet the text remained legible enough to glimpse the truth buried in between instructions and telemetry logs. Ajax had been chosen with care. Thorough medical screening, high cognitive response rankings, adaptability noted in bold technical terms. He had been raised and trained as though destined for greatness, groomed not to understand glory, but to ensure others could reach it. The mission briefs detailed his responses to test flights, his tolerance to the stresses of launch, his vital statistics under extreme conditions. In each report, success was inked with precision. Ajax was not an accident placed into orbit. He was a pioneer. Leon's fingers paused at a line near the bottom of one page, the ink smudged but still readable. Subject recovered alive pending retrieval. Just beneath, in a harsher, heavier stamp, confidential, access restricted. His throat tightened. Ajax had survived the return. He had lived long enough to be aware that he was no longer weightless, no longer rising towards stars, but instead sinking deeper into dark waters where no hand would reach for him again. The captain leaned back and ran a hand over his face. Every instinct inside him burned with anger, but the anger felt hollow, like shouting into the wind. It wasn't clear whom to rage at: the engineers who had designed the capsule, the officers who issued the orders, the politicians who sought victory at any cost, or the tides of history that chewed up sacrifice and swallowed it without remorse. Yet one truth had formed solid in Leon's mind. Ajax did not die because he failed. He died because someone succeeded and then walked away. He looked out into the night. The horizon was swallowed by ink, the sea a shapeless expanse reflecting nothing but the murk above. Somewhere below, miles deep, countless other secrets slept, but none of them had reached the surface demanding justice. This one had chosen them, or fate had chosen them to bear it. Either way, responsibility was a weight Leon accepted without hesitation. He stood and stepped outside, inhaling sharply as the cold air flushed against his tired face. The crew was scattered across the deck in pockets of uneasy contemplation. Marcus stood near the bow with arms crossed tight, gazing over the side as if scanning for threats. Eddie sat on a crate, elbows on knees, his expression stuck between awe and sorrow. Joe worked slowly at coiling rope that didn't need coiling, his hands performing a familiar task just to anchor his thoughts. Leon approached the group. They all looked up, searching his expression for leadership they needed more now than ever. "There's more in those documents than a simple accident," Leon said quietly, yet each syllable carried weight. This wasn't a failed mission abandoned in panic. It was a choice. Someone decided that Ajax wasn't worth retrieving. The bitterness in his voice tasted of betrayal, and the crew felt it. Even Marcus, ever the pragmatist, couldn't hide the discomfort twisting his features. Joe exhaled sharply. A space hero, buried alive by bureaucracy. Hell of a way to go. "They probably wrote it off the minute it landed," Marcus muttered. Cheaper to silence than to explain. Eddie hugged his jacket tighter. He must have waited for hours, maybe days. The idea was unbearable to him. What kind of people just forget like that? Leon turned toward the capsule, its form looming like a monument to injustice under the deck lights. People who celebrate success louder than they admit failure, he said. The captain stepped closer to the capsule once more, laying a steady hand on its scarred exterior. It was cold, colder than metal should be, as if the ocean's chill had embedded itself deep within its bones. He thought of the photographs of early astronauts he had seen in textbooks smiling bravely beside their capsules, faces filled with adrenaline and promise. Ajax had no such send-off, no applause, no pride, just a facility cage, a lab coat's detached pat on fur, and a machine that became a coffin. Leon opened the metal box again and removed a stack of mission records. He carried them to the center of the deck where the crew could see. There were diagrams of the flight path, weather reports from the launch day, orbital tracking data meticulously recorded, all clear evidence that the capsule had re-entered successfully. Another sheet listed the intended naval retrieval operation. That mission had simply vanished from the logs. A murky cancellation request scribbled in pencil marked the bottom of the page. Assets to be redirected, no recovery necessary. That single, callous note was the difference between a celebrated return and an unmarked grave. "This is wrong," Leon said, "and they wanted it hidden. They tried to bury him beneath the ocean and beneath history, but he made it back anyway. Now everyone is going to know." The crew remained silent, not because they lacked words, but because they finally understood their place in this unexpected story. They were the voices Ajax never received, but not everyone saw it as noble. One of the crew, a wiry man named Hayes, who had spoken little since the discovery, broke his silence with skepticism clawing at his expression. "And what if the wrong people show up once we hit port?" he asked. "Government men, military, they'll lock this up and us along with it. You think we're getting medals for dragging out some ghost that was supposed to stay gone?" Leon met his eyes, unblinking. "We didn't pull up a ghost. We pulled up evidence of a life they threw away." Hayes shook his head and retreated into his own unease. The seed of fear he planted lingered, though, threading itself through the dark like unseen rot. Leon squared his shoulders. Fear would not dictate their actions. "We secure the capsule," he said, "and then we call the authorities ourselves, on our terms. We'll make sure this isn't forgotten again." Marcus nodded, approval weighted by concern. Joe tightened the strap securing the tarp over the hatch. Eddie pulled his coat collar high and returned to his tasks with a solemn determination new found in his young heart. Hours passed while the Mary Ann resumed a steady heading back toward shore. Leon navigated from the wheelhouse, but kept stealing glances toward the deck where the capsule rested immovable as an anchor. He knew sleep would not come easily. His mind teemed with questions, both scientific and moral. Why had they refused retrieval? Did they consider Ajax a failure once his purpose was served? Or did they fear what revealing his return would imply? That commitment to life ended where headlines stopped. The documents hinted that Ajax's mission had rolled directly into a larger human spaceflight milestone. His success had cleared a path, his existence removed from the celebration that followed. His silence ensured no uncomfortable accountability disrupted the applause. Leon knew injustice well. He had seen men erased because they did not fit into the sanitized version of triumph. But this creature had not chosen to be a part of the lie. He had simply done what he was trained to do, and expected kindness at the end of it. By dawn, the sea glimmered again with silver streaks as the sun clawed over the horizon. A storm was brewing to the southwest, clouds stacking against one another like dark fortress walls. The pressure on the barometer dipped. The ocean had no sympathy for moral journeys. Marcus approached Leon and glanced to the changing sky. "Weather says we need to make good time," he noted. "Storm coming hard." Leon's voice lost the softness of contemplation and regained the steel of command. "Then we outrun it," he said. "This time we come home." But the ocean rarely let men reach shore without reminding them of its dominion. By midday, the wind churned higher, whitecaps slapping the hull as if pushing back against their course. Ropes strained, the mast creaked, and Hayes shot nervous looks towards the darkening horizon. He seemed more anxious about the capsule than the weather, as if he feared both fate and consequence barreling toward him at once. As Leon steadied the wheel, he thought of Ajax strapped in that quiet chamber, unseen until the sea eventually claimed even the memory of him. Now they were fighting to keep him above water, both literally and figuratively. "No one should die forgotten," Leon whispered under his breath, a promise shaped into words. Crewmen moved through the turbulence with a cohesion formed not just by labor, but by grief and duty. For the first time, they handled their ship not to feed their livelihoods, but to protect a narrative that deserved completion. Below deck, Eddie prayed quietly, not because he was told to, or because fear demanded it, but because Ajax deserved the words. A soul should be spoken to on its journey. Storm winds intensified, tossing the Mary Ann like a toy on a child's careless whim. Leon braced himself, knuckles white on the wheel. The sky ripped open with rain. The ocean roared its disapproval. Yet the capsule remained tethered, though each crash of wave threatened to loosen the bounds and return it to its watery grave. Marcus, soaked to the bone, struggled beside Joe to reinforce the bindings. Hayes stumbled toward them, panic etched on his features, and hissed over the storm's howl, "Let it go! Throw it back! It's not our problem!" Marcus shoved him back, not with aggression but conviction. "It became our problem the second we pulled it up." Leon didn't need to hear their exchange. His instincts screamed the same truth. Ajax had waited once, abandoned in silence. He would not wait again. Through the roar of the storm, Leon's voice cut sharp. "Hold fast. We bring 'em back, no matter what." The men rallied, renewed fire in their limbs as they tightened ropes bleeding seawater and sweat. The storm frothed around them, trying to tear the past from their grasp, but they refused to yield. By nightfall, the worst of the tempest had eased. Exhausted bodies sagged against rails and crates. The ocean finally allowed the Mary Ann to continue its homeward path. The crew breathed as though shared lungs had been forcibly emptied and refilled by the storm's fury. Leon looked at the capsule once more. Rain washed down its sides, cleaning away decades of grime and thin tracks. It looked almost reborn in the stormlight. The winds had not taken it. The sea had not reclaimed it. Ajax remained with the living. The truth remained with the living. As stars timidly revealed themselves above the thinning clouds, Leon let himself believe, for the first time since opening that hatch, that justice might truly follow this discovery to its rightful conclusion. Whatever forces once denied Ajax his honor had lost their grip. The past had resurfaced. There was no burying it again. Leon straightened his coat, eyes forward to the coastline still hidden by night and distance. Tomorrow, when they reached land, the questions would begin. The world would learn the name that had been sealed shut for decades. And Leon would make certain the story was told without erasure. The chimpanzee who had touched the stars would finally be remembered. The sea had not finished with them, even as the crew's sore muscles relaxed and the rage of the storm faded into a low, exhausted rumble. A different kind of turbulence brewed on the Mary Ann. The night that followed was thick, oppressive, filled not with rain or lightning, but with unspoken argument, fear, and a tension that could snap more easily than the overworked wires in the winch. Leon stood alone at the stern for a while, watching the phosphorescent churn dissolve into blackness. Behind him, the capsule loomed under its tarp, tied down by fresh ropes that glimmered with seawater, as though the ocean itself had wept over Ajax's fate. The captain's coat clung to him, soaked with salt and rain, but he barely noticed. His mind churned through everything they had uncovered. It was supposed to be simple. Catch fish, go home, get paid, live another day. Now they carried a dead pioneer whose very existence seemed to contradict the history books. He heard boots approaching behind him. Marcus came to stand shoulder to shoulder, not speaking at first. Men like Marcus didn't fill silence unless necessary. Finally, he murmured, "We're going to have trouble on shore, you know." Leon didn't turn. "Trouble has already found us." Marcus let out a breath that fogged in the cool night air. "I'd like to believe we're doing something noble here," he said, "but noble doesn't pay bail or hospital bills. If the government decides we stole something classified—" "We didn't steal anything," Leon cut in, sharper than intended. "We recovered what they abandoned." Marcus nodded once, not cowed by the bite in Leon's voice. "Doesn't matter how right we are if they decide to make us wrong." Leon sighed. His first mate was not challenging the mission, only bracing for the consequences. It was his way of showing loyalty. Hard truths spoken early. "We'll handle it," Leon replied. "One wave at a time." A shout erupted across the deck. Joe and Eddie rushed to secure a coil of rope that had started to unravel dangerously close to the edge. The sea wasn't violent anymore, but its aftershocks kept the ship unsteady, a reminder that peace was borrowed, never given. Leon walked toward the capsule again. The tarp rippled gently in the wind. Beneath it, the shape remained both terrifying and sacred. Hayes stood nearby, arms folded tight as though hugging himself. His eyes shimmered with anxiety. "You think anyone's going to thank us?" Hayes asked, bitterness coating each word. "You think anyone is going to care about a dead monkey from 60 years ago? We should cut the rigging and let the sea take it back. We ain't heroes." "No," Leon answered calmly. "We're the ones who were here." Hayes scoffed and turned away, but Leon saw the tremor in his jaw. Fear often masked itself in cynicism. Hours dragged by, the night stretching long as if the sun hesitated to rise on what came next. Each crew member drifted in and out of restless sleep, except Leon, whose thoughts refused to relent. He stayed vigilant in the wheelhouse, guiding the trawler with steadfast resolve. Their heading pointed toward port, toward civilization, toward questions and judgments neither the captain nor his men were prepared for. Before first light, Leon heard something that made his blood chill more than the storm had. Footsteps creeping toward the stern, slow and deliberate. Not the confident stride of a crewman working, a softer tread guided by fear and temptation. Leon left the wheel silently and moved down the stairs. The deck was painted in shades of dark gray and murky green by the early morning gloom, and there, hunched beside the capsule, hands gripping a rope's knot with trembling desperation, was Hayes. He was trying to cut it loose. Leon stepped forward, boots echoing sharply. Hayes froze. The knife in his hand glinted before it slipped from his fingers and clattered to the deck. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Leon's voice was low, calm, but deadly cold. Hayes spun around, breathing heavily. Panic twisted his features. "We shouldn't have this thing on board. It's cursed. It doesn't belong to us." His words stumbled together like a frantic man drowning above water. "We're messing with government secrets, and that's not something small men like us survive." Leon stepped closer. "You're right," he said softly, and Hayes blinked in confusion. "It doesn't belong to us. It belongs to history, to the truth, to a creature who did nothing wrong but trust the people who betrayed him." Hayes shook his head wildly. "You don't get it. They'll silence us. We'll be buried just like him. You're leading us straight into a noose, Captain." Leon took another step. Hayes backed into the capsule like a cornered animal. Leon's gaze hardened, steel sharpened by conviction. "If you'd succeeded," the captain said quietly, "you would have become the one who buried him again." Hayes looked down, ashamed, desperate, but the fear didn't leave him. Fear doesn't vanish just because truth arrives. Leon didn't raise his voice. Authority radiated cleanly from him, forged by decades of command. "Get away from the capsule," he ordered. Hayes obeyed instantly, stepping aside with trembling legs. Marcus arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion. Leon pointed at Hayes without breaking eye contact. "He's not touching the ropes again," Leon said. Marcus nodded and guided Hayes away, not gently, but not cruelly either. The crew would handle him. Panic was dangerous, but isolation could be worse. When Leon looked back at the capsule, he felt the weight again press onto his chest, not physical, but moral. He was responsible not just for the body sealed within that metal chamber, but for every living soul still on this ship. He reinforced the knot Hayes had weakened. His hands worked with reverence and anger intertwined. The ropes pulled tighter than ever, as though each twist vowed anew to protect Ajax until the very end. By midday, land was faintly visible through the morning haze, a thin gray line promising roads, buildings, humanity. Joe spotted the shore first and let out a long, relieved sigh, though the relief tasted uneasy, like a man waiting for a verdict. "We'll be home before sunset," Joe said. Leon watched the coast through binoculars, his jaw clenched. "Home," he repeated, unsure if the word still held its usual meaning. He scanned the harbor. There were too many shapes on the docks for this to be a quiet return. White vans, uniformed silhouettes, cameras glinting under the pale light like predatory eyes. It seemed news traveled faster than the sea. Eddie spoke softly beside him. "They're waiting." Leon lowered the binoculars. His face was unreadable. "Yes," he said. "They are." He looked at his crew, exhausted, frightened, yet standing their ground beside the capsule like guardians. They had faced a storm together, held on to something precious when the sea tried to steal it back, and now they would face whatever the world thought they deserved. Leon placed one hand gently against the cold metal surface beneath the tarp, as if to tell Ajax that his long-forgotten journey was almost complete. "No more silence," the captain whispered. "No more being left in the dark." The boat pushed on, engines humming with purpose. The ocean, though calm now, seemed to watch begrudgingly as they left its jurisdiction. The truth was crossing into the hands of the living, but the living might not welcome it. And as the harbor approached, and the crowd of officials and reporters swelled into clarity, Leon understood something very clearly. The real storm had not yet begun. The harbor of Seabridge was awakening, But this morning it did not stretch into daylight with the sluggish comfort of fishermen returning home with their ordinary burdens. Word had traveled, faster than the tides, faster than any radio signal the Mary Ann could have sent. A crowd gathered along the pier. First, a handful of curious eyes, then a cluster of reporters, until finally the unmistakable silhouettes of government authorities stood waiting like stone pillars planted between the sea and the land. The closer the trawler drew, the more every man on board realized they were no longer just sailors returning to port. They were witnesses of a secret history, and the world was ready to devour that testimony with hungry jaws. Leon gripped the wheel, his hands stiff, his face set in a calm mask that belied the storm inside him. As the boat eased into the harbor, the crew stood straight-backed, their rain-worn clothes clinging to skin that smelled of salt and fear. The capsule, still wrapped beneath its tarp, seemed suddenly enormous, a dark, accusing presence. Cameras pointed like rifles, every lens sharp as a threat. The bay's water rippled with the murmurs of spectators leaning over railings to catch a glimpse. "Looks like they rolled out the welcome wagon," Joe muttered, his voice low and edged with dread. Marcus's eyes were fixed forward, scanning faces on the dock. The authorities wore badges and clipped expressions. The journalists' features were bright with excitement and ambition. None of them felt like allies. Eddie, gripping the rail with steadying knuckles, asked the question that had been hanging over all of them. "What do we tell them?" Leon did not answer right away. He inhaled deeply, collecting the scattered resolve within him, and only then spoke. "We tell them the truth, nothing less." The hull kissed the dock with a muted thud, mooring lines thrown and secured. Before any crewman could so much as breathe in relief, a uniformed officer stepped aboard with a rigid salute, replaced quickly by a look of official concern. "Captain Hale," the officer began, his tone rehearsed. "You've recovered a classified object. We'll need to inspect it immediately. Your men will disembark for questioning." Leon stared into the man's face, refusing to yield the slightest fraction of authority. "We'll cooperate," he replied, "but the capsule stays under my crew's watch until proper identification and documentation are acknowledged." His voice carried a calm iron that the officer could not easily dismiss. Journalists surged forward from behind yellow tape as soon as they were allowed to approach the edge of the pier. Microphones and cameras angled toward the ship like a swarm of mechanical insects. Questions erupted in overlapping chaos. "Is it true you found a Cold War-era space capsule? Are there remains inside? Is it human? Animal? Why wasn't it recovered before? Is the government involved in a cover-up?" Hayes flinched at the barrage, turning his face away as though the words themselves were bullets. Eddie, pale but steady, stood near Marcus, his voice swallowed by the noise. Leon stepped forward, raising his palm. His expression silenced more reporters than any command could have. He spoke loud enough for the cameras to catch, yet with a measured clarity that cut through the clamor like a blade. "We found a space capsule belonging to the early days of the space race," he declared. Inside was the body of a chimpanzee astronaut who returned alive from orbit but was never recovered. His name was Ajax, and he was left at sea. Gasps flickered through the crowd like sparks through dry tinder. The officer stiffened visibly, already regretting that Leon had spoken first. Reporters shouted follow-up questions that blended into an unintelligible roar. The noise of revelation was deafening. More officials boarded, flanked by men who carried equipment cases stamped with insignia too official to be comforting. They approached the tarp-covered cargo with clinical precision, as if the capsule were an unexploded bomb. Leon and his crew surrounded them instinctively, a human shield of reluctant protectors. A senior official wearing a dark coat approached Leon. His face was lined with the decades of political weariness. "Captain Hale," he began in a level voice, "you've done something significant. But this is a delicate matter. We need to control the narrative for national security reasons." Leon's eyes narrowed, the memory of Ajax's lonely death sharpening his resolve. "He died because of controlled narratives," Leon said. "Not again." Behind them, the reporters recorded, every word becoming potential headline and evidence. The official's jaw worked in silent frustration. "Allow us to transfer the capsule. Our team will handle the remains with dignity. We'll make sure," Leon cut him off. "You'll make sure what? That he disappears again? That he's erased from history?" The official's facade fractured briefly, revealing something between guilt and annoyance. There were things he wanted to say, but would never speak aloud in this setting. The crew pushed back when the handlers tried to move in without permission. Hayes, surprisingly, joined the defensive line despite his earlier fear. Perhaps standing against an invisible enemy from the deep had been too frightening, but standing beside the truth among the living was something he could finally bear. The handler closest to the capsule paused. His eyes softened. "We're not here to harm anything. We're here to understand what happened." But Leon was not ready to trust unspoken promises. "Then treat us like part of the discovery team," he insisted. "We found him. We brought him home. We stay with him." A silence stretched long and taut. Finally, the senior official exhaled through his nose, long enough that his breath steamed in the cool air. "Very well," he conceded. "You and your first mate will accompany the capsule to the Space and Aeronautics Research Center in Cape Willard. The rest of your men will be debriefed and released." Relief and apprehension tangled in Leon's chest. He nodded. Joe rested a hand on the capsule, just for a moment, before stepping back. Eddie looked like he wanted to go too, but Leon gave him a reassuring nod. The kid had already seen more truth than most men his age could handle. The capsule was lifted carefully with a special crane, not the rough fishing equipment that had dragged it from the ocean's gut. As it rose above the deck, sunlight finally touched the scarred metal and revealed beneath the tarp's folds the faint markings of stars and stripes, mostly devoured by time. A once proud emblem hidden beneath barnacles now stood hesitantly before the eyes of an entire nation. Reporters aimed cameras at the capsule as if trying to freeze this moment forever in the digital amber of documentation. The world could no longer pretend this mission had never existed. Ajax could no longer be denied. Marcus and Leon followed closely behind the pontoon cart used to transport the capsule off the dock. A convoy waited, engines rumbling impatiently. The senior official motioned them into the lead vehicle, a stark black SUV that smelled of leather and controlled air. As they left the harbor, the boat and the men who remained behind shrank in the rear window's reflection. Eddie gave a small wave, trying to appear brave for his captain. Joe stood with arms crossed, glaring defiance at anyone who might try to diminish what they had achieved. Hayes lingered back, shoulders hunched, eyes tracking the capsule with a complicated mixture of fear and respect. The SUV's interior felt suffocating. Marcus stared forward, jaw clenched, while Leon kept his eyes on the road unfolding ahead. City streets blurred past in shades of gray and hurried motion. People on sidewalks turned their heads as the convoy passed, unaware of the silent passenger who was finally being given a journey toward recognition. Leon thought of the mission logs, the stamps of secrecy, the cold decisions that had written Ajax's fate. Somewhere in a room filled with smoke and maps, someone had nodded once and condemned a hero. That decision had echoed across 60 years. Now, after a lifetime sealed in cold blackness, justice was beginning to breathe. They reached the research center, its architecture clean and modern, built to celebrate progress without acknowledging the bones beneath its foundation. The convoy came to a halt, and the capsule was carefully unloaded by professionals wearing white gloves as if handling a royal relic. A representative of the agency greeted Leon and Marcus with a firm handshake that felt more like a performance for the cameras flashing nearby. "Welcome," she said. "We are deeply grateful for your part in uncovering this invaluable piece of our national heritage." Leon saw polished sincerity in her eyes, but he also sensed boundaries, the kind that protected careers more than dignity. He would remain vigilant. He would not let bureaucracy swallow the truth whole again. As Ajax's capsule was wheeled through the glass doors of the facility, Leon followed closely behind. He watched every motion, refusing to look away even for a heartbeat. This was not the end of the story. It was only the point where the world would finally be asked to listen. Marcus touched Leon's elbow, stopping him gently. "Captain," he said, voice low, "do you ever think maybe we weren't meant to find him?" Leon turned to his friend, eyes steady, voice unwavering. "The sea had 60 years to keep him," he answered. "It chose to give him up. That means we were meant to bring him back." Past the foyer, past the staring experts, past the bright walls lined with portraits of astronauts and engineers, Ajax was finally entering the halls where he belonged, no longer buried under salt and silence. Leon did not know what battles lay ahead. He did not know who else would try to rewrite the truth or bury it under technical jargon and classified red tape. But he did know one thing with the certainty of tides. Ajax had a name. Ajax had a story. Ajax would be heard. And as the doors closed behind them, sealing the outside world away, Captain Leon Hale swore silently to the fallen astronaut, to the ocean, and to himself. This time, he's home. The air inside the Space and Aeronautics Research Center was different from the ocean breeze that had clung to the Mary Ann. It was filtered, clean, unnaturally still, a place where the sky's conquest was studied behind glass instead of lived under the open heavens. Leon felt that sterility in every breath as he followed the capsule deeper into the facility. White floors reflected overhead lights like polished mirrors. Security personnel flanked every corner. Glass-sided laboratories showcased models of rockets and displays filled with screens cycling through star maps and telemetry data. People in lab coats paused mid-step when they saw the battered relic rolling by, their eyes widening with reverence, disbelief, and something like guilt. Ajax's capsule looked small and humble beneath the clinical brightness, a rusted metal survivor among pristine replicas. It had not been designed to tell a story on display stands. It had been designed to be a stepping stone, to help open a door that only humans would walk through afterward. Yet, here it was, having traveled farther than any life should alone. They brought the capsule into a specially prepared chamber. A tall man, with the silver in his beard, clearly one of the lead researchers, stepped forward with an almost ceremonial air. When the handlers carefully lifted the remains of Ajax from the capsule and onto a sterile examination table, a hush fell over everyone present. The bones, still held in place by scraps of suit and restraints, seemed impossibly fragile now. They deserved touch only from those who understood dignity, not just data. Leon stood beside Marcus, arms crossed tightly over his chest. watching as experts worked with gentle precision. Each strap was removed with the care of someone tending to a fallen soldier. When Ajax's skull was finally freed from the padded support, Leon exhaled slowly, as though he had been holding his breath since the capsule first opened. Something in that moment, the way gloved hands moved with respect and sorrow, assured him that they were truly trying to honor what had been forgotten. A historian began documenting the discovery, speaking into a device that recorded her soft, steady voice. She listed details, but unlike the cold mission reports Leon had read, her tone carried awe. Subjects like Ajax provided essential data that allowed humans to safely travel into orbit. Many early missions relied on animal astronauts to validate the systems and procedures later used by human crews. Leon wondered whether she had ever considered how one-sided that trust was. Somewhere along the observation rail, a reporter raised a camera to capture the moment. Leon stepped slightly forward, instinctively shielding the scene from exploitation. The senior official who had escorted them intervened, gesturing for the journalist to lower the lens. People were beginning to understand that this was not a spectacle. This was a reckoning. The head researcher approached Leon afterward, gratitude softening his scholarly composure. "You and your men did something extraordinary," he said. "Ajax's mission, we always suspected there were gaps in the records, but we never dreamed we'd find him. Not like this." Leon's voice was steady. "He found us," he said. "We just did what was right." The researcher nodded solemnly. "Soon there will be a formal ceremony, a memorial. His story will finally be told." As the hours passed, a new kind of storm gathered, a storm of truth. News outlets broadcast the discovery around the world. People reacted with astonishment and sorrow. Social media filled with tributes, sketches of Ajax wearing a little helmet, messages calling him a hero, letters from children thanking him for making spaceflight possible. Others questioned how governments could have neglected such a life. Commentators argued over the ethical treatment of animals in science, past and present. The silence of 60 years was shattered. That evening, Leon and Marcus were escorted into a small lounge where they could rest. Leon sat, but rest wouldn't come. The room had windows overlooking the runway, and beyond them a rocket gleamed under floodlights, tall and ready for its next mission. Humans had come so far while Ajax's body was rusting in the dark. Marcus rubbed his face with both hands and finally spoke. "We did good, Leon." "We did what anyone should," Leon replied. "It just took us being there." Marcus gave a tired half smile. "Funny thing is, if we'd hauled up fish like usual, nobody would know we even existed today." Leon looked at the rocket again. "We didn't ask for the responsibility. We just didn't run from it." The ceremony was scheduled 3 days later. In that time, the capsule was cleaned just enough so that its markings could be seen. The faded stars, the ghostly outlines of a forgotten flag. But the scars and corrosion were left untouched. They mattered. They were honest. The morning of the event arrived with a crisp blue sky, a sky Ajax had once traveled beyond. A crowd gathered in a broad auditorium beneath a suspended replica of an early space capsule. Children in uniforms carried small American flags. Astronauts in dress attire stood solemnly. Historians, engineers, advocates for animal rights, all had come to honor someone who had been denied this honor for too long. At the front of the room stood a glass memorial case containing Ajax's remains, now fully cared for and arranged with the kind of dignity owed to pioneers. His suit was reconstructed in part, the name patch restored enough to be legible again, Ajax. A small plaque was placed on the base, simple, respectful. Ajax, 1961. Returned home, 2025. First to touch the stars for those who could speak. Leon felt something tighten in his throat as he read the inscription. Words finally fit the truth. The head researcher stepped up to speak. He told the story of the mission, its success, its disappearance, the tragedy of abandonment. He explained how Ajax's triumph had paved the way for humans who followed. He spoke of sacrifice and responsibility. Then he turned toward the front row where Leon sat. "None of us would be here today," he said, "if not for the courage of early explorers, even those who did not get to choose the role they were given. And none of us would know this truth without Captain Leon Hale and the crew of the Mary Ann, who chose to honor what many had forgotten." Applause rose, not loud or triumphant, but deep and resonant. Leon wasn't used to being watched by so many eyes at once. His life had been lived in the margins of the world, where storms and nets and long nights defined purpose. But today, his purpose stood clear. He had brought someone home. As the ceremony closed, people were invited to approach the memorial. Some touched the glass softly, some bowed their heads. A little girl placed a drawing on the display. Ajax floating in space with a bright smile drawn beneath his helmet. It was the kind of image no classified archive could erase again. Later, when the crowd began to thin, Leon approached the memorial quietly. He rested his palm against the cool glass. Beyond it lay the remains of a creature who had once gazed at the stars with fear and wonder intertwining in his chest, the same way humans always had. "You deserved better," Leon murmured, "and I'm sorry you had to wait so long." His reflection appeared beside Ajax's in the glass. Two travelers, decades and species apart, bound now by a shared truth. He stood like that for a long moment, letting the weight finally ease from his shoulders. When he and Marcus were escorted back outside, a breeze greeted them. Warm, salted, familiar. The sky above the facility was wide and open, streaked with pale clouds. Leon inhaled deeply, filled with a strange mixture of grief, fulfillment, and something new, something like peace. "We going home now?" Marcus asked. Leon looked toward the distant ocean. "Yes," he said, "we've still got a job to do." The drive back to Seabridge felt softer than the trip in. The city moved around them again like normal life, unaware of the cosmic reckonings happening within its bounds. When they reached the port, the Mary Ann sat patiently at her berth, rocking gently with the tide. Joe and Eddie were waiting, leaning over the rail. When they saw Leon and Marcus, relief broke across their faces like sunrise. Eddie hurried down the gangplank. Is he okay now?" he asked, hesitant. Leon smiled faintly. "He is where he should be," he said. Eddie's shoulders relaxed, and for the first time since the capsule was pulled up, Leon saw real light in the boy's eyes. Hayes stood in the background, uncertain whether to approach until Leon stepped toward him. Hayes swallowed nervously. "Captain, I'm sorry. I was scared." Leon nodded slowly. "Fear's natural," he said. "Running from the right thing isn't." Hayes lowered his gaze. Leon clapped a hand on his shoulder. No more lecture was needed. The captain stepped aboard the trawler again, touching the helm with a familiarity only sailors could understand. The deck smelled once more like the living world. Fish, oil, rope, not sealed metal coffins or forgotten sorrow. Marcus looked around as though reacquainting himself with an old friend. "What's the plan now?" "We go back to work," Leon answered. "The sea doesn't wait." But as he gazed over the bow toward the endless blue expanse, he knew the ocean would never look the same. Somewhere beyond that horizon, beneath the restless waves, lay other truths waiting for someone to care enough to bring them into daylight. Ajax's story was no longer a secret. His voyage, tragic as it became, had made the world remember what it had forgotten. That sacrifice demands recognition, and courage deserves respect, no matter the species, no matter the silence imposed upon it. Leon turned the wheel gently, guiding the Mary Ann away from the dock. The engine thrummed. The wake rippled outward like a signature written on the sea. Above them, the sky stretched clear and vast, an invitation to anyone who dared look up and wonder. The ocean had finally returned Ajax to history. And now, in a museum filled with stars, his memory would shine brighter than the silence ever could. The trawler pushed toward the open water, carrying its crew forward, lighter now without the burden of hidden truth. Leon glanced once more toward the horizon, whispering a promise only the sea could hear. No one else will be left behind. Ever again. If you were shocked by this discovery, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next incredible story. Watch our other videos to uncover more hidden mysteries and unbelievable truths from around the world. And don't forget to share this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Your story could be next.